Let's make sure we all can see this. Just let me know if you can see this.
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
Okay. We're going to talk today about the start of bones, and this is a section on bone tissue. We all start out as cartilage. The human skeleton, which is composed of cartilage, basically consists of cartilage as a fetus and is replaced by bone, except in areas that require flexibility. And those areas are your joints. So that's why you have a lot of cartilage in your knee and in your shoulders, because you need flexibility. So we need to talk about cartilage again, okay? Remember, cartilage has no nerve supply and it has no blood vessel supply. It gets its blood vessel supply from the perichondrium, which is a layer of dense connective tissue surrounding the cartilage like a girdle. It helps the cartilage resist outward expansion and contains the blood vessels that gives the cartilage nutrients. Cartilage is made up of chondrocytes. Chondrocytes are the cells that live in the small cavities of the cartilage. Those small cavities are also present in bone, and those small cavities are called lacunae. And within the matrix of this lacunae is where the chondrocytes live. So, as you know, there are three types of cartilage. This is a review from the tissue lecture. Hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the most abundant. It provides support, flexibility, and the ability to stretch and recoil, otherwise known as resilience. Okay? It is in all joints. It is in your ribs. It is in your airway, your voice box, your bronchi of your lungs, and in the tip of your nose. Hyaline cartilage. Another cartilage is elastic cartilage. And as you remember, I told you that elastic began with an E, and so does where it is. It is in the external ear and in the epiglottis. And then the thickest of all cartilage and the strongest of all cartilage is fibrocartilage, and it is in your knee and in your spine. Your vertebral discs are made of fibrocartilage. Okay? So, but basically, here is where your cartilage is. Here is elastic cartilage. Here is hyaline cartilage. And here is fibrocartilage. Now, how does cartilage grow? Well, it grows in two ways. It grows by appositional growth, is where it grows from the outside. That means that cartilage forming cells in the perichondrium, which covers the outside of all cartilage, secrete a matrix that is laid down on the surface of the cartilage. It also grows interstitially, and interstitially it is maintained by chondrocytes. And these chondrocytes are inside of the cavities, which are called lacunae, and they make the new matrix, expanding the cartilage from the inside. So appositional growth is on the outside, interstitial growth is on the inside. Appositional growth is in the perichondrium, Interstitial growth is from the chondrocytes within the cavities of the inside cartilage. Calcification of cartilage occurs during normal bone growth as a child. When you reach puberty, you stop growing. And the reason you stop growing is because the cartilage that is in your epiphyseal plate of all bones calcifies. So at puberty, you stop growing. Your bones do not lengthen anymore. Your bones do not lengthen anymore. So what are the functions of bone? Well, there's 7 functions. And we'll go through each of them. Support, protection, anchorage, mineral and growth factor storage, blood formation, triglyceride or fat storage, and hormone production. The classifications of bones. There are 206 bones in the human skeleton. No, you don't have to know all the 206 bones in the human skeleton. I will tell you which bones you need to remember as we go into chapter 7. Okay? But the skeleton is divided into 2 groups, and it's based on location. The axial skeleton is the long axis of the body, and that basically is your skull, all the bones of your skull, all the bones of your vertebral column, and all the bones of your rib cage. The appendicular skeleton are the bones of your upper and lower limbs and the girdles that attach these limbs to the axial skeleton, like the hip and the shoulder. We classify bones by shapes. There are 4 shapes. Long bones, longer than they are wide. And these were basically the bones of your legs and arms. Short bones, cube-shaped bones in the wrist and in the ankle. And we'll talk about those bones because the bones of the wrist are important bones. So we'll talk about cube-shaped bones. Also, the short bones are sesamoid bones. Sesamoid bones are bones that are formed within tendons. And the largest sesamoid bone in the body is the patella. Can anyone tell me where the patella is?
Your knee.
Yes, your knee. This is your kneecap. This is your kneecap. Okay? Those are sesamoid bones. So those are short bones. So we have long bones and short bones. We also have flat bones. Flat bones. Thin and flat. Your sternum, that's your breastbone. Your shoulder blade. Your ribs. And the majority of your skull bones are all considered flat bones. And then we have irregular bones, which are complicated shapes. And those were basically the bones of your spine, the vertebrae of your spine, and your hip bones. Okay? So those are the 4 shapes of bones. All right? Here, long bone, longer than they are wide. This is your humerus, your upper arm bone. Okay? The sternum, a flat bone. Actually, it's 3 bones in one. And when we get into the bones of the axial skeleton, I will tell you the parts of the sternum. Okay? Short bones, the bones of the ankle and wrist. This happens to be the talus, which is the major bone of the ankle, and irregular bones. Look at this bone, very irregular shape. This is one of your lumbar vertebrae. Okay. A bone is an organ. It's the reason it's an organ is because it contains different kinds of tissue. It contains nerve tissue. It contains bone tissue, otherwise known as osseous tissue. It contains cartilage. It contains fibrous connective tissue. It contains muscle. And it also contains blood vessels. I want you to know that bone is highly vascularized. If you broke both of your femurs, you could easily die in shock because those are the biggest bones in your body and therefore have the biggest blood supply. Okay? So let's talk about structure. There are two types of bone in your body. Compact bone. Compact bone is a dense outer layer on every bone that appears smooth and solid. Spongy bone. Spongy bone is actually honeycomb bone. Small, needle-like pieces of bone called trabeculi are within the bone. And within the open spaces of these trabeculi is your bone marrow. Now, I'm going to tell you something you may not know. You have a red bone marrow and a yellow bone marrow. Does anyone know what's in red bone marrow?
Stem cells, I think.
Well, your blood. Yeah, your blood. You're right. You're right. Your stem cells. That's where your blood is. Your blood is made in your bone marrow, red bone marrow. Okay? So it's very important to understand that bone contains the precursors of all blood cells, Okay? Anyone know what's in yellow bone marrow?
Fat.
Yes, fat. You are correct. Fat. Okay? So red bone marrow is blood cells and yellow bone marrow is fat. Very, very good. Very good. All right? Here, spongy bone, trabeculi. Inside of this is red bone marrow. Red bone marrow. Okay? This happens to be your femur. This is the head of the femur, which attaches to your hip. And this is where we would stick a needle in to get your bone marrow if you wanted to give it to a cancer patient, or if you are having problems with your blood and we wanted to look at your bone marrow, we would stick a needle in here and take some of this bone marrow out and look at it. Okay? And here's compact bone. Look, smooth and solid, smooth and solid. Okay? Which do you think would break easier, here or here? You think spongy bone would break before compact bone, or compact bone would break before spongy bone?
Sponge bone?
Yeah, spongy bone. The most common place for the femur to break is right here, because it's so weak because of all the spaces in it, Okay? All right. You got to know a few words, and these are the words that I want you to remember. I want you to remember periosteum. Periosteum is the connective tissue membrane that covers the outside of compact bone. The endosteum is the connective tissue membrane that covers the inside of compact bone. All right? So these two words are very important. Very important. All right? Also on the outside of compact bone is hyaline cartilage, and hyaline cartilage covers every single joint. This is where hyaline cartilage is important. If the joint is movable, hyaline cartilage will be there. Okay? Here's a trabeculi of spongy bone. You can see that with inside of these holes, that's where your bone marrow would be. That's where your bone marrow would be. All right? Here's the difference. Compact bone, smooth and solid, spongy bone, holes. All right? So it's in between compact, spongy, compact. In between compact bone is spongy bone. All right? Other words you have to remember, not only for exam number 2, but you should always remember this. The shaft of the bone in a long bone is called the diaphysis. That is the shaft of a long bone. The bone ends at either end are called the epiphyses. The epiphyses. Okay? So the diaphysis is the shaft. And it consists basically of compact bone. And in the center is yellow bone marrow, spongy bone. The epiphysis, there are 2 of them, that's why it's plural. You only have one long shaft, but you have 2 epiphyses, a proximal and a distal one, are at the ends of long bone, and they articulate at the joint. And I'll show you pictures of the epiphyses of all bones, okay? Between the diaphysis, the shaft, and the ends of the long bones is known as the epiphyseal line. This is in adults. This is in adults. Before you reach puberty, you have an epiphyseal plate. Once that calcifies, bone growth stops. So once you reach puberty and calcium goes into the epiphyseal plate, you will no longer get taller. Okay? The epiphyseal plate fuses with calcium at puberty. We'll talk more about that on Wednesday, but that's important to understand. All right? Okay. Here, this happens to be the humerus, which is the upper arm bone. So here is the proximal epiphysis, which attaches to the shoulder. Here is the distal epiphysis, which attaches to the elbow. And here is the diaphysis, which is the shaft of the bone. Okay? Very important words. Very important words. And at each epiphysis is articular cartilage. And that articular cartilage is always hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage. Know those words, please. Articular cartilage, always hyaline cartilage. All right? Very important. So the membranes, we talked about the periosteum, which is the outer membrane, and the endosteum, which is the inner membrane. Okay? That's really basically all I want you to know. You don't have to know any of this. Oh, go back 1 second. Just know periosteum and endosteum. Periosteum Peri means around, outside. Endo means inside, inside. All right? That's important. That's really all I want you to know about periosteum and endosteum. You won't remember the rest. It's not important. Okay? But what is important is that bones have a very good nerve and vascular supply. You break a bone, it hurts. You break a bone, you're going to bleed. Okay? So the bigger the bone is, the more nerve supply and the more blood supply it has. It has arteries and veins. So if you break a bone, you can break an artery. You break an artery, if it's a big one, you can bleed to death. As I said before, if you break a femur, the upper bone of your lower leg, if you break it, you could bleed to death. You could bleed to death. So that's important. That's very, very important. Here's the yellow bone marrow. This is all fat. This is all fat. And you can see that the bone has a good blood supply to it. Here's a very good blood supply to it. All right. So what happens in the red bone marrow? Well, the red bone marrow has cells that mature to make your blood. In adults, the red bone marrow is located, as I said before, in the heads of the femur, the head of the humerus, and also in your hip bones. In your hip bones. Okay? Yellow bone marrow can sometimes convert into red if the person needs blood. Say you are anemic, sometimes your yellow bone marrow can turn into red bone marrow. But remember, the red bone marrow is in spongy bone, in spongy bone. Bone markings. There are certain bone markings that you should know, not all of them. But the reason the markings are important is because they are the sites of attachment to muscles, ligaments, and tendons. So some of the markings I want you to know, all right? There are projections and there are depressions and openings. And we'll talk about the ones that I want you to know as we go along, not only in chapter 6, but also in chapter 7. Okay? So, I want you to know what a tuberosity is. A tuberosity is a large, rounded projection. Okay? Right now, if you're sitting, you're sitting on the ischial tuberosity. Here it is. That's what you're sitting on. Okay, you're sitting on your ischial tuberosity. If you're lucky, you've got a lot of padding in between this bone and your seat, but this is the ischial tuberosity. Okay, another word I want you to know is trochanter. Trochanter is a large, irregularly shaped process. And basically, it is on the femur. And here they are. This is the trochanter. Okay? This is the lateral trochanter. This is the medial trochanter. Remember, this is your femur. In between the lateral and the medial trochanter is the intertrochanteric line. Why is that important? Because this is where old people break their hip, right here. in the inner trochanteric line between the lateral trochanter and the medial trochanter. All right? Another word I want you to know is epicondyle. Epicondyle is a raised area where tendons and muscles attach. And you have them in your femur. This is the proximal end. This is the distal end. You have a medial epicondyle and a lateral epicondyle. And this is where muscles attach to, right here. So I want you to know tuberosity, trochanter, and epicondyle. And we'll talk more about them when we get into the bones themselves. All right? The only other thing that you should know is that there are openings in bones. And one of the major openings in a bone is called the foramen. The foramen. It is a round, oval opening through bone. And there are several of them that I want you to know. And when we get to the specific bones, I will tell you which foramens are important and you should remember. All right? They're just big holes foramen. The rest of these words are not important. They're not important. Okay. The cells of bone tissue. There are 5 major cell types. I only want you to know 3. I want you to know osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. Those are the 3 bone cells I want you to know. So let's talk about them. You don't have to know this one, not important. But you have to know osteoblast. The word blast means building, building. B for building. Osteoblast, build bone. These cells secrete an unmineralized bone matrix called osteoid. Osteoid is basically collagen and calcium binding proteins. The majority of osteoid is collagen. Since they build bone, they actively divide. So osteoblasts are very active because they're building bone. Osteocytes. When you see the word site, you should think of maintaining. Maintaining. So osteoblasts build, osteocytes maintain. These are mature bone cells that no longer divide. They live in the cavities, the lacunae of bone. They maintain the bone matrix. Osteocytes. Osteoclast, when you see the word clast, the C means chewing. Osteoclast, break down bone. They are actually macrophages. They're multinucleated giant cells that break down bone. So you have osteoblasts that build bone, osteocytes that maintain bone, and osteoclasts that break down bone. Okay? Very important. These 3 cells are very, very important. Osteoblast, build it. Osteocytes, maintain it. Osteoclast, break it down. Any questions on that so far? Good.
I had a question from earlier.
Go ahead, go.
What exactly does happen to the bone when blood supply is cut off? Does it become more brittle and that's how or does it just die eventually, the cells?
It dies. It dies and becomes, yeah, it does. It becomes brittle and dies. It does die.
Okay.
When blood supply is cut off, yes, it will become very brittle and easy to break. Yeah.
Now, is there a point where it's too far to refix, or is as long as you get it before it dies, will it heal?
Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely. Yeah.
All right.
That's an odd question. Why do you ask that question?
Oh, I was just curious. I know it happens in a lot of older patients.
Yeah, it does. And that's it's all according what their underlying medical conditions are. Like if they are, the big one is diabetes. If they're diabetic and they're older, they have a very poor blood supply to their bone. So if they break a bone, sometimes the blood supply does not come back and you have to amputate.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
Did that
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Okay. All right. What does bone look like under a microscope? Well, you have a laboratory section, and I'm sure they're going to show you pictures of it. But compact bone, also called lamellar bone, consists of an osteon, which we will certainly talk about, canals and smaller canals called canuliculi, and interstitial and circumferential lamella. Here, this word is more important than all the rest. Know what an osteon is. Know what an osteon is. What is it? It is the structural unit of compact bone. It consists of a elongated cylinder that runs parallel to the long axis of bone. It is the pillars of weight bearing, the osteon, the structural unit of compact bone. I'm not going to ask you any other questions on this. Just know what the definition of the osteon is. You won't remember all the other stuff. Just remember the osteon, okay? And this is what it looks like. Elongated pillars that in the middle have a central canal, and in the central canal are arteries, veins, and nerves. Arteries, veins, and nerves. So that is very, very important. The central canal in an osteon contains vessels, arteries and veins, and nerve fibers. You don't have to worry about perforating. That's not important. But you should remember that in the lacunae, which are the cavities, that's where the osteocytes live. And the osteocytes' function, as I said before, is to maintain bone. Maintain bone. Okay? So that is very, very important. The lamella, you don't have to worry about. That's not important. Not important. But that was compact bone. Let's talk about spongy bone. Spongy bone is poorly organized. Poorly organized. It has holes in it. It has holes in it. There are no osteons in spongy bone. Okay? But there are osteocytes. There are osteocytes, and those osteocytes maintain spongy bone. And in the capillaries of spongy bone, in the endosteum, remember the endosteum is the internal membrane which supplies the nutrients to spongy bone. So if you talk about the difference between compact bone and spongy bone, compact bone is very organized. It has a central canal. It has arteries, veins, and nerves. But in spongy bone, there are no osteons. It is poorly organized, and it gets its blood supply from the membrane, the internal membrane, which is the endosteum. So I told you that basically the osteon is the matrix, and the matrix that is produced by the osteoblast has no minerals in it. So it's got to have minerals. Okay? So bone is made up of not only organic material, which is protein, but also inorganic material, which are the minerals, The osteoid itself allows it to stretch, But when we add mineral salts to it, it now resists compression. Which mineral do you think we add to bone to make it hard? Anybody?
Calcium?
Say it again.
Calcium?
Yeah, calcium. Calcium is the most abundant mineral in your body, okay, because it's in all bones, and bones make up the majority of weight in your body. So calcium is basically the inorganic component of bone. There are other things, and we'll talk about the other things, but that's important, okay? Okay, again, the organic components of bone are all the cells that we talked about: osteoblast, osteocytes, osteoclast, and the osteoid. The osteoid basically is the matrix that is made by the osteoblast. It consists of basically collagen and a gel-like substance called ground substance. That is the osteoid. The inorganic components are now the mineral salts. And those mineral salts all together are called hydroxyapatites. And it makes up the majority of the mass of the bone and basically consists of calcium phosphate crystals. Calcium and phosphorus go together to form the mass of the bone. This calcium phosphate crystal matrix is responsible for the hardness and resistance to compression. This is why your bone lasts longer than you do, because of the mineral composition. We can unearth bones from early man that have outlived, obviously, man because of calcium phosphate. And these mineral salts are called hydroxyapatites. So that's what we're talking about. Okay? Any questions on that? I do want to show you another part of chapter 6 so we can talk about bones starting on Wednesday. So let me show you part B, because there are a few things in this section that I want you to know, and there are a few that I don't want you to know. All right? Ossification is the process of making bone tissue. All right? I don't really want you to know the embryology of bone. That's not important. So I'm not going to talk, I'm going to just run through this. I'm not going to ask you any questions on this. It's not important. It's not important. But what is important is after you're born. How do bones grow? How do you get taller? Interstitial growth requires the presence of cartilage at the epiphysis. And that area is called the epiphyseal plate. The epiphyseal plate maintains a constant thickness. And in this area of growth of your bone are zones. And there are basically 5 zones. The resting zone is called the quiescent zone. It's relatively inactive. Below that are 4 other zones in the epiphyseal plate: the growth zone, the hypertrophic zone, the calcification zone, and the osteogenic zone. This is in the epiphyseal plate. Remember, you're growing as you get older. Once you reach puberty, growth stops. That's very important to understand. The growth zone is exactly what it is. New cells formed, pushing the epiphysis away from the diaphysis, causing bone lengthening. Okay? The hypertrophic zone is basically an area where older chondrocytes are closer to the diaphysis, because as bone grows, the chondrocytes go inside medially into the bone. The calcification zone is where the matrix calcifies. This is when the cells that maintain the matrix start to die, and those cells are called chondrocytes. The ossification zone is ultimately replaced by spongy bone, Okay, so here is the epiphyseal plate. This is in a young person who is still growing, When they reach puberty, this fuses and this line goes away. There will be no line there. So if you took a picture of my knee, I wouldn't have this line. Here it is. Whoop. Here it is. This is the epiphyseal plate. This is the femur. This is the tibia. As you go older, this becomes a line, no more plate, a line, okay? And you stop growing once that epiphyseal plate goes away. Here it is. When you become an adolescent at age 16, 17, 18, 19, chondroblasts divide less. They're not making any more bone. The epiphyseal plate thins, is replaced by bone. The epiphyseal plate closes and becomes the epiphyseal line. Bone lengthening ceases. Females around 18, males around 21. Your bones continue to grow thick. So that is important. you still continue to get thick bones, but you don't continue to get longer bones. That is very, very important. Here's your epiphyseal plate. Here it is. It's made of cartilage, and that cartilage is hyaline cartilage, and so is the articular area. The articular surface of all joints is hyaline cartilage. So that's all important, very important. Okay? What I want to focus on are the hormones that regulate bone growth. There are several hormones that you have to remember, and here are 3 of them. Okay, actually 4 of them. Okay? Growth hormone. Growth hormone is the most important hormone in stimulating the epiphyseal plate. The activity of the epiphyseal plate in infancy and childhood is controlled mostly by growth hormone. Another hormone, thyroid hormone, modulates the activity of the growth. So growth hormone is the most important. Thyroid hormone modulates it. The sex hormones, testosterone in males and estrogen in females, promote growth spurts. Once the epiphyseal plate closes, these hormones have no further effect on bone growth, lengthwise anyway. So growth hormone, thyroid hormone, and the sex hormones. If you have an excess or deficiency in any of those, lengthwise anyway. So growth hormone, thyroid hormone, and the sex hormones. If you have an excess or deficiency in any of these hormones, you will get problems. An excess of growth hormone will make you a giant, will make you 8 feet tall. 8 feet tall. Okay? A decrease in thyroid hormone will make you a midget. So will growth hormone. If growth hormone is a problem and you don't have enough of it, it'll make you a midget. But growth hormone by far is the most important hormone when it comes to bone growth. All right? We are constantly remodeling bone. Remember, even though your bones don't get longer, they can get thicker. They can get thicker. So osteoblast and osteocytes and osteoclast are working all the time. So that's important, especially important if you break a bone. If you break a bone, that's really when the osteoblasts and osteocytes and osteoclasts come in to work. So that's important. What if you break a bone? If you break a bone, the fragments of those bones are reabsorbed by osteoclasts. Remember, these things break down bone. They break down bone. Okay? They deposit the minerals back into the bloodstream, and they try and give you a new area of bone where the fracture is. So that's important. That's important to understand. And then a new bone matrix is deposited by the bone builders, the osteoblasts. And calcium is very important. Calcium is what is added to bone matrix to make the hardness of bone. Once you have calcium in the bone matrix, you have a calcified bone matrix. And here again is the word hydroxyapatite, the mineral salts. Basically, calcium phosphate. Calcium and phosphate form the crystals. Form the crystals. There are other hormones, and the two other hormones besides growth hormone, thyroid hormone, and the sex hormone that have a plan when it comes to bone remodeling and bone growth are the parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid gland and calcitonin from the thyroid gland. These two hormones regulate calcium production. You don't really have to know much about them because you're going to have much more about them in Bio 114, but parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium levels. When you increase blood calcium levels, you stimulate osteoclasts to break down bone so that calcium can be released into the blood, raising blood calcium levels. If you have too much calcium in the body, calcitonin will lower your calcium levels. So that's what you have to know. You have to know that parathyroid hormone raises calcium levels, calcitonin lowers it. And there's a balance. There is a balance, of course. So you can have low calcium levels, otherwise known as hypocalcemia, and high calcium levels, also known as hypercalcemia. Okay? So know the difference between low and high calcium and what hormones control it. Oh, don't worry about Wolff's Law. Wolff's Law is not really 100% accurate, so I'm not going to ask you any questions on Wolff's Law. Not really important, but I certainly, as a doctor, need to talk to you about bone fractures. Bone fractures, as you know, are breaks in bones. The majority of fractures as a youth or as a young adult are caused by trauma. However, as you get older, your bones become weaker, your bones thin, and you can have a fracture without trauma as you get older. There are multiple ways to describe fractures. We look at the ends of the bone and see where they are positioned. A non-displaced fracture has retained its normal position. A displaced fracture means the ends are out of normal alignment. That's the position of the bone. We also talk about the completeness of the break. A complete break is it's broken all the way through. An incomplete break, it means it's not broken all the way through. This is very common. An incomplete break is very common in children because their bones are not 100% calcified and they get an incomplete fracture. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when I show you a picture of it. Okay? We also talk about whether the skin is penetrated or not. If the skin is penetrated and the bone is sticking out, it's an open fracture. We used to call it compound. We don't call it that anymore. We call it open. If the skin is not penetrated, it's closed. We used to call it simple. We only call it closed now. Open means it's open to the air and the skin is broken. Closed means the skin is closed. We can also describe it as where it's located. Okay? Here's an example. Here's an example. Comminuted. Comminuted means that there are many bone fragments. Here, 1, 2, 3. Many bone fragments. Okay? Comminuted. Compression means the bone has been crushed, and that's usually in the spine. A crushed vertebrae. It is a compression fracture. A compression fracture. Okay? Spiral fractures. You twist your ankle, and here it is an S-shaped fracture, a very common sports fracture, a spiral fracture of the distal femur, of the distal femur. We can also have an epiphyseal plate fracture. Here is the upper arm, the humerus, and right where the epiphyseal plate is, it should be up here. You can see the epiphyseal plate is now here. That's an epiphyseal plate fracture. All right. And as you notice, not only is this a fracture, there's a fracture right here too. Right here too. A depressed fracture. A broken bone, usually in the skull, here it is a depressed fracture. And a very common fracture in children, because their bones have relatively more matrix than an adult does. It is a green stick fracture. A green stick fracture means that it is an incomplete fracture. Here it is. An incomplete fracture. A complete fracture would be right through the whole bone, but an incomplete fracture occurs in children, a green stick fracture, because if you try and break a green stick, it won't break all the way. This is why it's called a green stick fracture. An incomplete fracture in children. Okay? How do we fix it? Well, we can do a closed reduction where I can manipulate and correct the position, or I can have an orthopedic surgeon come in and open it up for an open reduction and put pins and wires in. But either way, I'm going to immobilize it, and I'm going to mobilize it into a cast. And most fractures in normal people take between 6 to 8 weeks to heal. Okay? So whether it is a closed reduction or an open reduction, I'm going to immobilize you in a cast. Okay? So how do we repair bone? Well, bone repair is in 4 stages. At first, you have hematoma formation. You break your bone. I told you that bone has a good blood supply. So you're going to bleed and you're going to get a bruise or a hematoma. Then you're going to get fibrocartilaginous callus formation. Then you're going to get bone callus formation. And then you're going to get bone remodeling. So the first thing that happens when you break a bone is that you tear blood vessels. And these blood vessels bleed. And they form a clotted mass called a hematoma. Obviously, it's swollen. Obviously, it's painful. And obviously, it's inflamed. Here it is. Hematoma formation. There it is, right there. The next step is that you get a fibrocartilage callus. Capillaries grow into the hematoma. White cells and other phagocytic cells clean the debris. Fibroblasts, builders of cartilage, secrete cartilage, and they span the broken areas of the bone. Fibroblasts, cartilage, and osteogenic cells come and they build spongy bone. This mass of repair tissue is called the fibrocartilaginous callus. Here it is. The hematoma is now gone. This is all cartilage, all cartilage. The third step is bony callus formation. Within a week, trabeculi appear. The callus is converted into a bony callus, and it takes about 2 months to form. Calcium is now added to the callus. Here it is. Calcium is now added to the matrix. A bony callus forms. After the bony callus forms, that's when the excess material is removed. And what cells do you think remove the excess material? Osteoclasts. They remove the excess material. Compact bone is laid on the spongy bone to reconstruct the shaft, and now you have a final structure that resembles the original structure. A healed fracture. Those are the 4 steps in healing of a bone fracture. Hematoma, fibrocartilaginous callus, bony callus, remodeling. Those are the steps. Okay? There are numerous bone diseases. There is osteomalacia and rickets. These are protein diseases, vitamin diseases. We'll talk about a little bit about them. There's osteoporosis and there's Paget's disease. I want you to know osteomalacia, I want you to know rickets, and I want you to know osteoporosis. I'm not worried about Paget's disease. Osteomalacia is a vitamin D deficiency or a calcium deficiency. Osteomalacia. You can remember this by M is mineral, and the mineral missing is calcium. To absorb calcium in your body, you need vitamin D, and the mineral missing is calcium. To absorb calcium in your body, you need vitamin D. So either vitamin D deficiency or calcium deficiency is the cause of osteomalacia. The bones are poorly mineralized. There is an osteoid, but the calcium salts aren't there. There are no hydroxyapatite crystals. This results in soft, weak bones, and there's pain on weight bearing. Rickets. Basically, rickets is osteomalacia in children. It is due to a vitamin D deficiency. And in children that have rickets, they have bowed legs and other bony deformities and multiple fractures. So rickets is osteomalacia of children, a calcium or vitamin D deficiency. Osteoporosis is a protein disease. P for protein is where bone resorption exceeds deposit. The matrix is normal, but the bone mass declines. This is very common in adult females, and they have compression fractures of their spine and hip fractures. Osteoporosis. This is normal bone. This is osteoporotic bone. Risk factors for osteoporosis, basically postmenopausal women. Postmenopausal women. Because the sex hormones in a female is estrogen. It plays a role in bone density. When levels drop at menopause, women are at higher risk because they have low estrogen. Low estrogen. It's very uncommon in men because testosterone protects osteoporosis effects in men. Okay? A poor diet and calcium or protein, insufficient exercise, smoking is always bad, inherited by genetics, or other conditions like diabetes or hyperthyroidism, or certain medicines and alcohol. How does one prevent osteoporosis? Well, exercise, adequate calcium, and vitamin D. That's how you can prevent osteoporosis as you get older. Okay? Paget's disease, I don't really care if you know. It's not important. Not important. All right? Well, we did chapter 6. I'm impressed. Let me stop presenting.